Very good morning to everyone. The title of my paper is Economic Planning in India's Economic Performance, a Re-Examination. Well, that's the tentative title anyway. Before I begin, just a little bit of background regarding Indian history to just put what I'm saying in perspective. For nearly more than 100 years or maybe 150 years, India was a colony of the British. In 1947, she got independent from the British. And in 1950, they put in place a central economically planned economy, or went down the road of development planning, whichever way you want to say it. In 91, there were a set of like pro-market reforms introduced. So that's where we stand today. Well, at independence, India was a very underdeveloped economy. More than 70% of the workforce made its living off the land. The production processes were very short. There was not many capital goods. Nearly 80 to 80%, 85% of total commodity consumption were of agriculture or manufactures based on agricultural materials, which means very short processes of production. Now, all economists who have analyzed the Indian economy, all have concluded that, prior to independence, the GDP growth rate of India was, in the 1 to 1.5% per annum range. But post-independence and the introduction of economic planning, it went up to about the 4%, per annum range. And they conclude from this that the introduction of economic planning was, caused a huge improvement in India's economic performance. What is surprising here is that this view is held by economists regardless of their political beliefs. So you have, of course, India is famous for a, vast horde of economists who are pro-planning. But there are few who are supposedly free market. For example, the most famous being Jagdish Bhagwati, who is at Columbia University. He's a renegade planner. He was a planner before, but he's moved towards free market over his career. More recently, there is his student who also teaches at Columbia University, Arvind Panagaria. But what's surprising is that these economists too, even though they support the pro-market movement of the Indian economy post-1991, they all agree that, the introduction of economic planning did boost India's GDP growth rate. They hedge that. They say that, the growth rate wasn't as high as it should have been to eradicate India's poverty. It wasn't as high as as other countries' growth rates were, who also gained independence around the same time and didn't introduce economic planning. But they do nevertheless concede that, there was this huge boost to India's GDP growth rate. And, so we can't say that economic performance did not improve. That seemed like surprising to me when I was reading this, because I was like, how can you support, or oppose planning and support the market when you can't, when you're saying that, the introduction of economic planning did lead to an increase in improved economic performance. So this is very, all the leftists, the Indian leftists, the pro-planners, they all generally, they always say that, if only planning had been done right. If only we had got the bureaucracy right, if only, we had actually kicked out all the private producers, if only, this growth rate would have been 10%, 12%. But you get my point. My paper attempts to critique this view that, the introduction of planning and the causation between that and GDP. My basic point is that given the nature of the Indian economy and given the nature of production in a centrally planned command economy, that GDP figures can no longer be interpreted as indicators of economic progress. That's my basic thesis. Well, before I get into a few words about the Indian economy and the planning, I just want to briefly speak about what is the vision of the Indian planners. When we analyze a market-based economy, we never ask this question because, entrepreneurs are producing thousands of different commodities. Nobody has any one vision which, they want to take the economy towards. But in the Indian case, in any case where there's a centrally planned economy, the vision of the planners becomes very important. In India's case, the economic planner was Jawaharlal Nehru. Until his death in 1964, and my paper really deals with the first 15 to 20 years of India's in post-independence economic history. He was the economic planner, and all plans went through him. He was the prime minister as well as the head of the planning commission. So if you, I mean, just as, even a superficial perusal of his writings, will show you that his basic vision for India was to make it an industrial superpower. So rapid industrialization, but also not only just rapid industrialization, but rapid industrialization within Indian borders. So we have to produce these, heavy machinery, power, and, these all these capital goods, but we have to do it in India. We cannot be dependent on other countries. So, quoting from one of his many speeches, he says, the real strength that is for a country comes from industrialization, from modern techniques. The test of real strength is how much steel you produce, how much power you produce and use. And he goes on to say, you cannot advance or industrialize this country without an industrial base. And an industrial base means basic industries and mother industries, heavy industries and the like. And he said that if you do not establish that industrial base, you not only do not advance fast enough, but you're tied up to other countries who are economically dominant over you. You are not economically free completely. So, it's like socialism in one country, kind of. But, what were the means that the Indian planners used to achieve these ends? They did build up a huge public sector. Under the first 3-5-year plans, more than 50% of allocated investment was towards the public sector. And the public sector was built up in specifically these so-called, what Nehru's called mother industries or heavy industries. Machine tools, power, iron and steel, things like that. But at the same time, all private firms were not nationalized. It wasn't like the Soviet Union. It wasn't what Mises has called post office socialism, where every firm is nationalized and resembles the post office. Instead, there was an extensive public sector, and it coexisted with this private sector. I guess you could say India in some ways resembled more a command economy, what Mises would have called a Zwangswirtschaft. That's my best German, but okay, but what the government did was it assumed vast powers of control over the private sector. And the most important power of control it had was it introduced this industrial licensing system under the Industries Development and Regulation Act. So under the Act, all private industrial undertakings had to register with the central government. Furthermore, no new industrial undertaking could be set up, and no existing undertaking could be expanded without obtaining a license from the government. All licenses minimally specified the product and its maximum quantity. In addition, the Act gave the central government the right to specify the minimum scale of the plant and the location of production. So, complete, almost total control over the productive activities of the private sector. Over and above this, you had import and export licensing so that the central government could allocate scarce foreign exchange. You had capital issues control under the Companies Act of 1956, which is largely to do with how the private sector can raise capital from the markets and things like that. Then there was price and distribution controls. Well, a whole vast, set of controls. Now, what is important to understand, and this is sometimes been missed when people have dealt with India's economic history and the planning, was that these, interventions and controls weren't ad hoc. They were all tools used by the planners to direct private production and investment. So, in a sense, the Indian planners were really smart. They realized that, it's a poor country, we're not going to be able to do everything through the state, so instead we'll keep whatever private sector had existed, whatever private industrialization had existed, we'll keep it as it is, and instead we'll use these controls to channel it to the ways, we want it. And of course, implicit in this is that there was a big, linkage between the government and the big business, which, I have not gone into enough, but I think it's quite obvious from this. Now, what is important to understand is that the state had ultimate control over production, and that the private sector was private, you could say, only in a legal sense. There was no private enterprise in existence. In fact, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry of India, when it was describing the criteria on which, these industrial licenses were issued, it stated that the schemes submitted by the entrepreneurs under the Act are carefully examined, taking into consideration not only the technical feasibility of the schemes, but also certain factors such as the present and future demand vis-a-vis plan targets, availability of raw materials, appropriate location, and the importance of the item in the light of the priorities fixed in the plan. Well, just a short word now about GDP figures. GDP figures measure the value of final goods and services produced in an economy over a given time period. And they therefore necessarily make use of data on prices and goods and services produced. Well, they are historical in nature. So when you look at a GDP figure, it's something which happened at a particular point of time. Those goods were produced at a particular point of time in a certain country. Now, when they're used as indicators of economic progress, you implicitly assume, the analyst implicitly assumes that production aims to satisfy consumer desires or consumer preferences. Because, production is never an end in itself. It's only a means to an end. So when you say that the GDP, of a country went up over a certain period of time and that's a good thing, you're saying that, yeah, those goods which are produced aim to satisfy consumer preferences. So the question that then arises is, does the nature of economic activity, the nature of an economy, does that affect whether production is geared towards consumer preferences or not? Can you say that a market-based economy as well as a centrally planned economy both cater to consumer preferences, or is there a difference? So that would affect the interpretation that how you interpret GDP figures, historical figures. So we know in a market-based economy, Mises spoke about this. He said the key aspect of a market-based economy is that the private entrepreneurs are allocating capital. And each entrepreneur appraises, or you could say looks into the future before he takes on a production plan. He takes on a production plan if he believes that the revenues that he can generate from that production plan will, more than cover the cost that he has to incur on the factors of production. So, and then of course, if an entrepreneur succeeds in this, he's basically and if he does make a profit, that means he has allocated resources to areas which satisfy consumer preferences. If he makes a loss, he hasn't and he's out of the market and other entrepreneurs step in. But Mises also pointed out that there are certain institutional preconditions which are required, which is basic for this process to take place, for this profit loss system to be in place, for there to be what he called monetary calculation, which the entrepreneur uses. Now, those institutional preconditions, the institutional precondition is the private property ownership of the means of production. Now, we see that, whenever, and that's Mises' second point was that when there is common ownership or when there is socialized means of production, that there would be no way the planner would be groping in the dark. There is no cost accounting. There's no way for him to engage in cost accounting. There's no profit loss system. He cannot calculate. Now, I understand that these arguments apply to pure socialism, a socialist world economy where all economies or the whole world is socialist. When you apply it to countries such as India, you have to, hedge the argument. I understand that. So, for example, India was just one country in the world economy. Even within India, as Murray Rothbard pointed out, in Man, Economy, State, he said that you generally tend to overestimate the socialization in, for example, a socialist country like the Soviet Union. There's black markets, there's, the unorganized or the indigenous sectors in these economies which you're not able to, take over. But you can say that to the extent that that the state allocates scarce resources and capital, that there is huge irrationalities in the factor markets. Especially in the market for capital goods, because while you have a black market or while you have an indigenous, they are all engaging in short processes of production. But definitely in the longer process of production, in the capital goods, especially when a poor country like India is taking on rapid industrialization, the argument holds especially for those industries. But we have to remember that Mises' argument, you could, in that argument, assume that planners are trying to satisfy consumer preferences. In fact, that was the strength, in my view, of Mises' argument. He said, even if planners are there saying, look, we want to satisfy consumer preferences, even then they wouldn't be able to do it because they don't have factor markets. There is no cost accounting. There is no profit loss system. But we see that in the case of, for example, India, that planners weren't even trying to be economic. They were blatantly uneconomic. They weren't saying that, yeah, we know there are consumer preferences, we know we have to produce and cater to them. The market is irrational, it's anarchic, we'll do our best. No, they were saying, what we need to do is to rapidly industrialize. We need to take a poor, country which prior to independence was importing most of its capital goods, and we need to convert it into this, industrial superpower. So they are being blatantly uneconomic. They're blatantly not even trying to satisfy consumer preferences. So, as a result, you can see that in a command economy such as India's, the state makes production decisions, prices if they exist are mere parameters, profit loss systems break down, and most importantly, production becomes an end in itself. Like, it's no longer a means to an end, and the economy is more like a machine. So that has implications for what we can say about GDP figures and whether we can interpret GDP figures to be indicators of economic progress or not. So, that's my basic thesis, that given the nature of the Indian economy, given that it was highly, more or less a command economy, given that they were planners of blatantly uneconomic in their proposed allocation of resources, that you can no longer say that just because the GDP growth rate went up, that it was good or it was a signified economic progress. In conclusion, what I'd like to say is, and this is something I've not worked on enough, but that, okay, if you don't look at GDP, you need to try to look at something else, to see, did India during this period actually, I've lived there, my parents have lived there. I know that nobody, became better off. But when you're analyzing, you need to look at it more closely. So in this respect, there is, one neglected book written by Sudarshan Roy, called India Planning. It's called India Progress or Poverty. It's a monograph, issued by the IEA in 1971. It's a short book, but her breadth of historical knowledge about, India is phenomenal. And in that she actually does a bit of what I was hinting at. She looks at things like, the food grain consumption per capita and, the extent of cotton textiles or cotton yarn per capita. And she looks at things like that and finds that, through that period, they stayed more or less the same and there was no true development. So, thank you for your time. Sorry, I couldn't get a question.
Could you repeat the question louder, please? Okay. In view of India rapid urbanization, and even more so in the next 20 or 30 years to come, can India meet that challenge without economic planning?
Yeah.
Elaborate on
firstly, I believe that whatever I know, that the recent trends are a result of the reduction in planning. So, like the Indian urbanization in India, especially now, it's trickling down to the smaller and smaller, what they call the tier 2 or the tier 3 cities, not only the basic 4 or 5 metropolitans. It's because of the reduction in economic planning, because now more and more allocation of capital is in the hands of the private entrepreneurs. I believe that, and that was the greater the extent of planning, the greater the extent of, restriction of factor markets, the tougher you're going to have to achieve any end. So.
It's not that there's no planning, it's a question of who's to do the planning.
Yeah.
Politicians or participants in the market. There's an American law and economics scholar named Bernard Sagan, the late Bernard Sagan, who wrote a book called Land Use Without Planning. And part of it is a case study of Houston, how went for decades without any zoning laws. And they did fine. Yeah, Houston is still there.
Still in that zoning.
And so they're still in that zoning. And so it's a myth that you need government planning for urbanization.
To bring into the previous talk, one of the things that happened in India is that they allowed capital to come in. Is that correct?
Yes
now
and
there's
no.
a free flow of capital. You can buy stocks in India.
Yes, much, yeah. Sure.
But my broker suggests Indian stock. How transparent is it? And do we need these international accounting things to help reassure investors in the United States about what's going on in India?
I wouldn't know too much about.
Right away.
I wouldn't know too much about that, but I guess there's a lot more transparency today than. I mean, in fact, like I think there was an article which Rothbard wrote called, I think, "The End of Calculation Debate Revisited." Or I forget the exact title, in which I'm paraphrasing here. He said that he asked Mises this question that, okay, if you line up all economies from the most market-based to the most socialist, what is the one feature which swings it one way or the other? And Mises replied, the existence of a capital market. So in that sense, the Indian stock market is alive and kicking post-91 as compared to pre-91. So in that sense, I guess you have a lot more transparency that comes with greater trade.
And just to tie that to Tom's comment also, that, the idea that many people have that, let's say there's an Indian firm seeking capital on foreign capital markets. There are outside investors who might be willing to make that investment if only they received pieces of information A, B, and C. The idea that the Indian firm would be unwilling to provide that information in the absence of a state-mandated disclosure system implies that the firms and investors are leaving huge amounts of money on the table, when there are obvious incentives for private planning, so to speak, or for the agree on standards of information disclosure that would be mutually beneficial. Let's get Gil.
My question is, to what extent are you aware of literature, or have you looked yourself at the actual compilation of GDP statistics in India, which obviously is done by a bureau which has incentives to supply the information that the planners want, and also to what extent are they able to game the historical numbers from pre-planning times?
Well, I don't trust the GDP figures of India or any statist or planned economy. Definitely not. But my argument, basically, what I feel is that I don't need to get into that. Even if the figures are right, it doesn't matter. Even if all the figures were collected, honestly by all government officials, and there's nothing you can't raise a finger about that, it still doesn't mean anything. You still can't interpret it as indicators of economic progress. And that's why I didn't get into that. I'm aware of it.
Curious, my understanding is India used to have input output tables that they produce every 5 years, possibly as part of the 5-year plan.
Yes.
And whether they might actually consider de-emphasizing or not using them anymore.
From what I know, there exists a planning commission still in India, but it's no longer what it was, no longer what it used to be. It's more like, it's just there for show. They still come out with 5-year plans. I think we're on the 11th or the 12th right now. They do come out with it, and it's more now towards, social welfare programs such as poverty alleviation and things like that. But while that's there, I don't think that those input-output, they're not the state is not allocating capital on the basis of those input-output, on the basis of those 5-year plans anymore, because they've basically reduced the extent of control over the private sector.
Okay, thank you very much.